everyone. Welcome to Ask the Alliance. I'm going to give everyone just a few minutes to see a bunch of people connecting to audio. Awesome. All right, looks like mostly everyone is connected to audio, which is great. Go ahead and all right. Thank you everyone for joining Ask the Alliance today. I know this one was supposed to be held yesterday, but I appreciate everyone joining us today on Friday. We are excited for our Bee Talk today. The Alliance is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to bring together communities, companies, and conservationists to improve our lands and waters in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Last summer, the Alliance hosted its first live talk webinar series, which we called Breakfast on the Bay, and we united Alliance staff expertise with our partners' expertise to explore the impact we have on the Bay. As our staff continues to grow, our expertise does too, which is really exciting. So this year, Alliance staff will share their knowledge and passion for what you can do to both enjoy and improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay, and you'll of course have the opportunity to ask the Alliance. With the hope for these sessions to be as interactive as possible, feel free to join with your camera turned on, but please remain on mute. You will have the opportunity to ask questions. You can send them via the chat box or in the last few minutes of our segment where we do our Q&A. You're more than welcome to submit them there as well. This session will be recorded, so if you need to hop off or if you'd like to share it with a friend, colleague, family, anything like that, I'll be sharing it later this afternoon. And with that, today I'm excited to welcome and introduce Savannah Lightcap, our Green Infrastructure Projects Assistant, and Brittany Smith, our Pennsylvania Agriculture Projects Manager, to talk all about bees. Brittany and Savannah, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. As Lauren said, I am Savannah Lightcap. I am the DC Green Infrastructure Project Associate, and today we're going to be talking about bees. So first of all, what are pollinators? Pollinators are anything that's going to transfer pollen from one place to another. Why are these beneficial for us? So some plants are self-pollinated, while others rely on the pollinators themselves to help transfer this pollen, which will fertilize the plants by moving the pollen from the stamen of the flower to the stigma, ultimately producing fruits, seeds, and continuing the life cycle. So what are some types of pollinators? They're not just bees. They can also be moths, wasps, birds, flies, bats, and butterflies. So what makes bees different? We have several different types of bees. Right now, we're just going to look at honeybees and native bees. So some differences are honeybees are social bees. They live and work as groups, whereas the majority of native bees are solitary and will only get together to mate before separating again. Their habitat. Honeybees live in honeycombs-filled hives, while native bees nest underground for laying eggs. Stingers. Honeybees have smooth stingers and only sting in defense and will die after stinging. Native bees have much smaller stingers that can be too weak sometimes to even penetrate the human skin. Feeding. Honeybees will gather pollen and nectar from any plant in bloom, while native bees will seek out specific plants to forage from. And their coloring. Honeybees tend to be darker in color, while natives are bright and can even have metallic features sometimes. So I interviewed Teresa Severino from Horace Mann Elementary, who is their beekeeper, to talk about some key differences between honeybees and wasps.
Hi, my name is Teresa Savarino. I'm a beekeeper here at Horace Mann Elementary in Northwest DC. We now have at any given time 4 to 6 beehives. So honeybees have their own distinct appearance. They have a barrel-shaped body, and they are very fuzzy. They have branched hairs over much of their body that hold the pollen well. They even have hairs on their large compound eyes. Their coloring is usually golden and brown, or sometimes darker. They have 2 pairs of wings. They also have a groove on their 2 hind legs that they pack with pollen mixed with a little nectar, and they can carry more than a third of their body weight in nectar or pollen, or sometimes they carry other bees when they're. So if we consider wasps, yellow jackets are wasps that are often mistaken for honeybees, and the big visual difference is that the wasps have a noticeably small connection between their thorax and their abdomen. They're smooth and shiny rather than fuzzy, and their colors are brighter. In terms of behavior, like most wasps, they are predators. Yellow jackets must catch insects to feed their young. So wasps generally do collect some pollen, but they also catch insects for their food source. And this predatory nature means they also pursue humans more aggressively than the bees do. So honeybees don't generally go looking for an animal or a human to sting. That would be very rare. They generally only sting to defend their hives. And because they have a barbed stinger, they will die after they sting. So wasps may sting repeatedly as they have a smooth stinger. And if you come upon them, they may sting you just because you're in the area. We have about 20,000 species of bees worldwide, with about 4,000 of those in North America and about 500 different species in this mid-Atlantic region. In wasps, you have about 30,000 species around the world. So what can non-beekeepers do to support honeybees and native bees? Any patch of open earth or any patch of grass you can convert, plant native perennial plants. These feed our 500 native bee species and also our honeybees. And their pollination supports the greenery you see all around you. Hi, my name is Teresa Savarino. I'm a beekeeper here at
After speaking with Teresa about the different types of bees and how to tell them apart from wasps, I also had the chance to speak with Amy Jadodnik to talk about how we can support the bees in our local areas.
Hi, I'm Amy Jagodnik, and I'm the school garden coordinator at Horace Mann Elementary School. Now, what is a pollinator garden? So it's a garden that's designed to support and maintain the various kinds of pollinators. That would be insects, that could be birds, and it supplies the food that they need, whether that's pollen or nectar, that they need to survive and stay in your local area. And in turn, they're going to continue to support your local flora by going and doing their pollinator activities. So it's a win-win situation. The reason we're doing this, and the reason there's a recent focus on this, is that the pollinators have really suffered a lot of habitat loss. There's been a lot of misuse of chemicals in the garden and in yards. And there's been a spread of invasive plants and animals, and that has really affected the habitat for these insects and birds. When you're trying to plan for a pollinator garden, what should you think about? Well, one is you could create a very formal, beautiful, full garden with hundreds of plants, and that would be lovely. But it doesn't need to be that. It could be something also very simple. It could be a small corner in your yard where you're going to put some supportive plants for the pollinators. It could be a small meadow plot that's in the tree box in front of your house. It could be an area of the lawn that you just don't mow at certain times of the year, and you let the small little clovers and violets grow and flower, and so that the tiniest little native bees can thrive in the early spring before everything is flowering. So the reason we want to use native plants in the garden for pollinators is partly because they are adapted already to this place. So they're adapted to our soil, they're adapted to our climate, and to our growing seasons. And that is part of what's going to make them low maintenance for us. They ecologically will naturally support those insects that live here. That makes common sense, right? So we're supporting the local pollinators with local plants and providing that shelter and that habitat and that nectar that they need to survive. So you really want to look for a spot that's full sun to part sun, because you'll have a wider array of flowering plants that you can choose from. So some of the things that I would choose, and these would all be perennial plants. Now, perennial plants are the ones that come back every year. You plant them and they just come back every year. They'll die back in the winter, but they resprout in the spring. And I would recommend bee balm or columbine, goldenrod, Joe Pye weed, liatris, borage, penstemon, parsley. Parsley, believe it or not, parsley is a pollinator plant. Perennial sunflower, yarrow, black-eyed Susan, clover, coneflower, asters, ironweed, and hyssop. And if you want to look for more resources, those would all be perfectly suited to our climate, but you can get even more plant resources if you go to the Pollinator Partnership website, or the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, or the Xerces Society. Hi, I'm Amy Jagodnik, and I'm
Thanks, Savannah. So my name is Brittany Smith. I serve as the Agriculture Projects Manager here in Pennsylvania. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the bees and how they support agriculture. Here you can see a list on the right-hand side of all or some of the crops that bees can support. That would be native bees, native pollinators, and honeybees would all help pollinate these vegetable crops. Just wanted to mention that a lot of bees have adapted to various crops, specifically like the squash bee or the blue orchard bee are adapted specifically to, say, squash plants or orchard crops. So it's really important to be able to provide the habitat for them so that they can do their job and provide us with delicious food. Traditionally, I think most people are familiar with honeybees in a sort of pollination industry where beekeepers would rent out their colonies to pollinate cherry orchards or almond crops in California, apple orchards, and pears as well. Also, beekeepers keep, there's a big honey industry, and so the bees are kept for those reasons. But here's a traditional setting where the bees would be placed out during the peak flowering period so that they can maximize production and pollinate. Without this pollination service, the crop wouldn't produce the fruits that we all love to enjoy. So they really do bring a huge benefit to us and the environment, but also just in terms of our food systems. In that previous picture, you can see that orchard there was really a monoculture of one crop. So whether it's cherries or pears, usually they're all grown in one big block, which isn't the most helpful for pollinators in general because it doesn't add a lot of variety. Like some of the other speakers earlier mentioned that the bees and the plants have sort of adapted to each other over time. There's not all bees will pollinate all plants. Honeybees are a little bit more opportunistic, so they'll plant anything or pollinate anything that's flowering. But native bees and other pollinators really might only pollinate and visit certain flowers. So one really cool thing in conservation is the fact that orchards have started planting these pollinator strips or hedgerows. Farms and orchards alike have started to adopt this practice where they plant either a single plant or a variety, like you can see here, this native meadow,
on the sides or in between their blocks of orchard crops to increase other pollinators to the area, drawing them in naturally. So here you can see a really beautiful stand of crimson clover on the left. It serves as a great cover crop too. I plant that in my garden at home. And then on the right there, there's a wider variety of native flowers there. So what's been touched on earlier is that the bees are in trouble. I think we're all sort of aware of that and definitely concerned. That's probably why, one of the reasons why you signed up for this webinar. And just wanted to talk a little bit about why they're threatened. Mainly it's just the loss of habitat around. There's invasive plants, and also just the aesthetics of keeping a lawn is a huge monoculture there, where there's not a lot of flowering opportunities for the pollinators to nest or forage for food. I found a really interesting fact that actually we produce 4 times the amount of lawn than we do in acres of corn. And we do have a lot of corn out there, so I can just imagine how much lawn is there. It's just not providing the habitat that we need to give those native pollinators a chance. A couple other things, the use of pesticides. The broad use of pesticides really creates some drift, which ends up in other areas, other habitat areas, and those pollinators pick that up and then end up taking that back to their nesting areas, or can even build up in honeycomb over time and then results in colony collapse disorder. So it weakens their immune systems and sometimes outright kills them. Also, another thing that honeybee keepers are struggling with are varroa mites. Basically, if you keep bees, you also keep mites. It's just a part of keeping honeybees in the modern day, and it's something that you just have to deal with. And if it's left untreated, the honeybees can die. So there's just a lot of threats out there, and it's important to just learn about them and do the best we can to mitigate that. I just wanted to share a little bit about my story. I got started with beekeeping about 4 years ago. I took a class at the Horn Farm Center, which is out in York County, Pennsylvania. Mostly I was just interested in bees in general and pollinators. I was fascinated by the hive and just the organism that the bees kind of produce as one. And also was just really interested in homesteading and gardening and wanted to be as self-sufficient as possible. So I thought I'd take a course in beekeeping and learn as much as I can. It was a 9 months course where we learned a little bit about the bee cycles and managing bees in different ways. And then at the very end of the year, we got to take home our very own colony, which mine overwintered successfully. And then since then, I've expanded just from that one colony. I've now have 7 colonies. So it's been a wild journey and I've learned a lot, but just wanted to share a little bit about what I've learned from the bees themselves. So one of my favorite things about keeping bees is all of the honey that I get. It's a great byproduct. I'd say last year I had 4 hives and I took out about 6 gallons worth of honey. It's quite a lot. If you've ever picked up a box full of honey frames, there you can see a picture of the honey frame, a full honey frame in the middle there. I've got medium boxes that are 8 frames deep, and that can weigh anywhere from 40 to 50 pounds. So it is quite a lot of honey, and I'm right about the time of year where I'll be harvesting honey again, and I'm really looking forward to doing that because it's very fun. I actually had so much honey, I was giving it away to friends and family, but I decided to start making mead, which is fermented wine basically made out of honey. You can see that fermenting there. I've got a 3-gallon carboy there that I mixed with some apple cider and made what's called a sizer. So I've had a lot of fun just experimenting and learning and eating the delicious honey, of course. So here's just some photos of when I get into the hive, what things look like. Typically what I'll do is I'll light up my smoker, which sends up smoke signals, making the bees a little bit more calm. basically they'll go into the hive and start gorging themselves on honey because they think that there's fire nearby. And so they don't feel quite threatened, but they're definitely more concerned and focused on other things than instead of focused on you as the beekeeper opening up their home. So I'll pry open the lid, take a look what's inside. I try to check on them every few months. You certainly could get in there more often if you'd like, but I take more of a minimalist approach to beekeeping. I want to say just letting them do as bees do, and then just checking on them every once in a while to make sure that they're doing okay, or to harvest honey, or to treat them for mites, for instance. So here you can see in that middle photo, I pulled out a full frame of honey. It's all one color there. It's just beautiful capped honey. So I was able to take those and I actually just put them in my freezer so that when I had a full freezer full of drawn honey, I could then extract that. But then I also ran into a couple other frames that here on the right there, you can see where the honeybees actually have brood. Those darker colored cells right there is their young that they're slowly going to be raising. And then there's honey that's capped all the way around that. So you'll see that typically in like the lower part of the hive where they're raising their young and they want to have food accessed very close to them. So in that case, I would leave that there for the bees to continue to take care of their young and grow the hive. And then anything additional, usually they tend to store their extra surpluses of honey above that. So those top boxes there is where you get that in the summer when there's peak flowering and peak honey production. So the way I tend to pull the honey off is you can see, so I have an unpainted wooden contraption there underneath that top box. That piece is called a triangle skateboard, and it's just a little contraption that makes the bees leave that area, but then they cannot find their way back because it's sort of a maze to get back into that box. And so I'm able to encourage all of the bees to leave their honey and go back into either foraging or taking care of the brood, and then I can take off that extra honey surpluses. Now, you're thinking, am I robbing all the bees of all their honey? Certainly not. You definitely want to leave about 50 pounds or so of honey for them over the winter. I'm just sort of taking off that excess because if I didn't do that, they would have to protect that all winter, and it would be really difficult to do so just because of the cold. They tend to cluster down in the winter there. So I'm kind of doing them a favor, but I'm also doing myself a favor. So just some more photos. Springtime is definitely the most exciting time for beekeeping. That's when bees are growing very quickly. They're producing a lot of young and they typically start to swarm. So if you haven't heard of swarming, it's a natural progression of bees when they outgrow their colony. And so they recognize this and realize that they don't have the space to grow for the rest of the year to store honey or to expand. And so the workers will actually lay queen cells and start to feed them and breed new queens. And the old queen gets a sense of this. And so as that new queen is about to be born, which takes about 2 weeks, she will gather her workers and they will gorge themselves on honey for a few days and then leave at once. Usually it's on a nice, bright, sunny day in the spring, I'd say like mid-April. Usually you can tell that it's coming when you've had a bad couple of rainy, cold days in the spring, and then all of a sudden you get a really nice warm day. I always know that that's going to be a swarm day. So they'll merge from the hive, and if you've never seen this, it's an incredible sight because they all sort of stream out at once, and it's just a wild sight. There's really no concern for stinging at this point, just because they're looking for a new home. They've got nothing to defend. They are just following the other workers and the queen, and they want to all stay together. So it's usually sort of quick. They'll stream out and within 5 minutes, usually they're settled down somewhere else. Either they have a new location to go to, or they'll find somewhere close by to sort of cluster and kind of regroup and then figure out where their next home is going to be. So I've been really lucky. A lot of my swarms haven't left outright. They would settle in my trees in the backyard or my neighbor's trees. And these photos here, just right there in my backyard. And if I'm around and I have the chance, I do try to collect them, because who doesn't want more free bees? So they're my own genetics and my own bees. So normally I tend to have a lot of extra boxes on hand just for this occasion. And it does get a little tricky kind of catching these swarms. You always want the swarms to find a lower spot just so they're easier to capture. But here you can see this one was quite high. So I climbed up that ladder and I grabbed a nice long like metal stake, and I wrapped that around the branch and pulled it down, and all the bees came down with it. And I had a box there. And sometimes I have to try a couple of times, but luckily I was able to capture them. If you get the queen inside your box, then you know you're golden, because all the other workers want to follow that queen. So you can see there in the bottom, they're clustering together and all sort of going into that box to be with the queen. And then I'll take that box and I'll usually put it in more sturdy equipment. And then I have a new colony. So that's always an exciting time of year. I think this year I had maybe at least 6 swarms. I didn't catch them all, but if you ever have a swarm at your house, you can always call your local beekeeping society. There's always many beekeepers on hand that are interested in collecting swarms, and they will happily come to your house and scoop them right up. So just keep that in mind. Got another photo of another swarm that happened this spring. This one was on a rose bush that was only 2 or 3 feet off the ground, so it was quite easy for me to capture. Basically, I slid that box right underneath them and shook the branch right into it, and they just dropped in. I did have a video, but I guess it wasn't working. Basically, once that queen is inside, you'll actually get to watch all of the bees start streaming in. They pretty much march in together. It's a really neat thing. And just like the more I spend with bees, the more I'm fascinated by them and just want to learn and explore with them more. You can even see, I don't know if you can see close enough, but they'll stick their butts up in the air and sort of fan their wings. They're sending out pheromones at this point, since they were disturbed and they're not in that cluster form anymore. They're telling all their other sister bees that that's home now and where to find them. So it's just really cool to watch that. I'll mention too that all the colonies, I think, are about 80 to 90% female bees, and 10% are the drone bees. And the drones really are responsible for defending the hive in openings, and then also mating with other queens from other boxes. But most of them are female. Here's another neat picture. I was really lucky to be called to help a beekeeper extract a colony that had made its home in a sycamore branch. I guess the sycamore, it was a very old tree, and one of the branches came down in a storm, and the landowner noticed that there were bees going in and out of that opening there at the bottom of the branch. And so they realized that there was a colony in there, and they called the beekeeping club, which happened to be one of my neighbors is also a beekeeper, and she brought me along. And so we cut open this branch and found the colony and scooped out all of the comb, putting them in a new box with new frames. And we found the queen and watched all the bees march into the new box. So it was a really neat experience, just of a bee colony in the wild. It had probably been living there for several years, and it was a really healthy hive, and just a really neat experience. I also had another friend that had called me about some bees that had set up shop in a shed, and there you can see another beekeeper was brave enough to go in and dismantle part of the shed so that he could get the comb and therefore get the bees. But yeah, it's just really exciting to see them doing their thing out in the wild. So I learned a lot from just my 3 years of keeping bees, but I say the biggest takeaway that I have is really bees sort of changed the way that I looked at my environment. Like, I want to say that my backyard wasn't just my backyard anymore. I was starting to look at my yard through the way that a bee might look. I was thinking about my neighborhood more on a larger scale, and what the foraging opportunities were for them. So just kind of blurring the lines of backyards and thinking on a larger scale. I'd be walking around my neighborhood and notice a honeybee on some clover in a park nearby, and would wonder, is that my bee? Is that a neighbor's bee? I don't know, but it was just really neat to just start looking at all the forage opportunities out there and start adding to them in my backyard, but also at friends and family's houses as well. How can you support them on a larger scale? I'd say there's 2 different ways. One, if you're really interested, become a beekeeper. They're really fascinating creatures. You'll learn a lot from them, and it'll really change your perspective on what it's like to produce honey, but also just create habitat for bees. But 2, I mean, bees aren't for everyone. They are a lot of work. It's very fun, but you can also just passively plant bee habitat. The earlier speakers definitely talked about different flowers and trees that you could plant. And there's so many ways to just add perennial habitat to our environment. So 1, if you want to become a beekeeper, I feel like there's certain traits that you kind of have to have. If you're curious and love to learn, or you love troubleshooting, observing, experimenting. There's just so many different ways to manage bees that it does take a bit of research and a little bit of experimentation, a lot of sitting on YouTube or talking to other beekeepers. I think I've heard the saying that if you ask 3 beekeepers the same question, you'll get 6 different answers. There's so many different ways to take care of bees and different preferences based on what your goals are, whether it's pollination or honey production. So, you know, it's just like endless exploring, and you're constantly learning. So maybe you enjoy building bee boxes, or love expanding and providing life. That's another good reason to become a beekeeper. You do need to have the extra time and space. Equipment can get quite expensive, but you certainly can always sell bees and just kind of spread the love that way, or sell honey. And of course, if you want a surplus of honey, that is definitely a great byproduct of keeping bees. If you don't want to keep bees, you can still support them. Biggest way is just planting those native perennial plants, providing for as much habitat as humanly possible, building that back into the land, and sort of taking that lawn out of production and creating just a beautiful paradise of all the different flowers out there. I've had a lot of fun just experimenting with different flowers, especially ones that like bee balm or ironweed or milkweed, really things that just are just so beautiful and continue to grow and expand. Another good way is just to leave dead plant materials over the winter. So 75% of bees are actually solitary bees, and that's a lot of the native bees are solitary, and they use that dead plant material to lay eggs for the next year and overwinter if they're overwintering. And so when you clean everything up and make things look extremely neat and tidy, you're actually removing a lot of that habitat. So I think there's a good balance of where you could use leaves as composts, or just leaving some of the dead flower and stock materials there until the next spring. Let that break down. It actually provides really great habitat and doesn't have to look super messy. There's many ways to go about that. And the last thing I'd suggest is just educating yourself, your neighbors, your family, your friends, to talk about how they can also plant native perennials. And you can host a garden party, or go meet your neighbor who's a beekeeper and ask them questions. But learning about bees as much as possible, because there's just so much to know. So just wanted to share again some plants that you can plant. These are all really good native perennials. I think the biggest takeaway from this is that the more you can extend the season, the better for both honeybees and native bees. There's certain times of the year where there's a dearth or less flowers available for forage. July is one of those periods, early spring as well. So if there's certain plants that you can plant, like goldenrod and aster come to mind, there's that purple flower there and the yellow one there in the corner, are really great fall forages. And I'm from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and there's just not as much native meadow around. And so there's very little goldenrod or aster. So it's something that I've added to my backyard to increase that forage into the fall. And there's a lot of other plants too that you can plant in early spring. So you just want to create a lot of variety there so that you have continuous blooms throughout the season from, March to November if you can. And then one thing that most people don't think about is actually planting trees to help support pollinators and bees. The trees provide flowers so much more than flat land can, because it's got all that vertical space as well. There's a lot of native trees that I like, and these are a couple of examples. I'd say tulip poplar, red blood, and black locust, and basswood tree are all really great examples of things that you can do to extend the season. Red bud blooms really early, black locust I believe as well, and just provides so much more forage opportunity for bees because they're not just looking on the ground, that they've got all these layers of flowers that they can go to. Heard a statistic of, I guess you could plant an acre of sweet clover on the ground and that might produce 200 pounds of honey an acre. But if you plant just 2 basswood trees, you can increase that by 6 times. So you would potentially get 1,200 pounds of honey out of that 1 acre. So it's just incredible the amount of the volume of nectar and pollen that the trees actually really do provide for the bees. So I would just suggest, if you're interested, to go and learn more and connect with local groups, because honeybees are really just adapted to different areas. And then too, if you want to support the native bees, join a Master Gardener program. They're with the extension, and they provide all sorts of classes and opportunities to get involved and volunteer. But there are a lot of local beekeeping clubs as well. That's really where I've learned the most, just talking to other beekeepers and sharing stories and observations and different experiments. So just encourage you to get connected wherever you are locally and just keep learning. And I will recommend that there's a book called Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy. He's a professor out of the University of Delaware. And he's really been transformational in my knowledge on native plants and how they support the native insect population. So I'd highly recommend reading that book too, if you want to learn more. But that's all I have for now. I'm happy to take any questions that you all have about honeybees or pollinators in general.
Thank you so much, Savannah. Brittany, this was awesome. We do have some really great questions that came throughout the presentation. So first, I just want to clarify, Brittany, something you said about the how many pounds of honey. Was that 1 acre of clover is 200 pounds, and then 2 basswood trees offer 1,200 pounds?
Yes.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
It's really incredible. It's like quite a statistic.
Yeah, I'd say. Okay, so we're gonna kind of jump back a little bit, talk about swarms really quickly. There's a question that came in about, should swarms be left in nature rather than capturing them? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You certainly can leave them go. They will tend to find some sort of natural cavity to go into, like that sycamore branch that I showed the photo of. There is a chance that they might end up in someone's attic or a shed, but it's really hard to say where they're going to go. But if you do call a beekeeper, they will take good care of them and give them a home too. So there's really no right or wrong answer there.
That makes sense. Sorry, just making sure I grabbed all the questions here.
Oh, one thing I
Go
could
ahead.
add too about the swarms is that sometimes, and it's more rare, but a swarm could happen in midsummer or even in the fall. And at that point, the bees are pretty much guaranteed to not make it through the winter, just because they won't have those resources built up that they would have had all year to do so if they would have left in the spring. So at that point, it's actually really imperative to get a beekeeper there to collect the swarm, because they can give them frames of honey or frames of brood from other colonies that they have that have extra, and make sure that they're going to survive the next year.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Would you mind sharing the name again of the course you took in York County?
It was with the Horn Farm Center. Not sure of the name of the course, but they only have one beekeeping course, so I'm sure you'll be able to find it if you get on their website.
Yeah, I'll pop a link in the chat to the website for everyone.
I will say they do fill up very fast, so if you're interested, you might want to sign up sooner than later.
And then let me pop back over to the questions. Sorry about that. Talked a lot about native plants, which was great. If anyone is interested, the Alliance has a whole host of native plant past webinars and videos we've done. I'd be happy to share some links to those in my follow-up email with the recording, so you guys can learn a little bit more about, you know, best native plants for full sun, shade, partial, and how you can potentially plant some more natives at home. I guess I feel like you kind of answered most of these questions. I'm just looking really quickly. Do you have any good resources, either Savannah or Brittany, on identifying bees? Is there any good like books that you guys would recommend, or any websites, things like that?
I don't have any books. My expertise is more on the honeybee side. But I know the Xerces Society, which we can link to, is a really good resource just for pollinators in general. And one of our staff members, Rebecca Lalver, gave a presentation on just strictly native bees last year that was recorded. So I will pop a link there in the chat. So if anyone's really interested, they can watch that.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like you guys answered most of the questions that got submitted beforehand and the questions that came in the chat. If anybody has any last questions they want to ask of Brittany and Savannah, feel free to either pop them in the chat here or come off mute and you can ask them live. Thank you, Emily. Great resource you shared here as well. All right. Well, again, thank you so much to both. Oh, sorry, Tari, you did ask this question. I had it written down. I totally skipped it. Brittany, do you want to talk really quickly about what you do about mites in your hives?
Yeah, so there are a lot of ways to treat the mites, some more chemical heavy than others. I choose to go the more organic route, and so I use oxalic acid. So it's just like this little white powder that you buy a vaporizer for, and I'll check my bees a couple times a year just to, there's a couple ways to check the bees too, or you can do like a sugar roll or like an alcohol wash, where basically you sacrifice a couple 100 bees to count the mites that are actually on them, calculate a percentage of how infested the colony is, and that will kind of dictate how much you need to treat them. It's a bit complicated, but it's very important to stay on top of.
Is that something you're doing, like you're just like consistently checking for?
Yeah, usually in the spring or fall, that's when we'll treat for the mites. You don't want to do it around the honey production, even though it's an organic compound. I'm unsure if it affects the honey, so I do try to do that after I remove any sort of honey frames that I'm keeping for myself. It doesn't hurt the bees at all.
Thank you. And then one last question. What is your position, either Savannah or Brittany, on insect hotels? Any thoughts?
I don't really have too much of an opinion. I have one in my backyard, but I haven't really seen it being used. So I don't know if I'm doing anything wrong. I think they're cute. As long as they're managed well, I think they're handy. But I think more importantly, it's just better to have that like dead plant material around so that they can sort of find their own way there. I don't know if human manufactured things always work the way they're intended, but that's just my opinion. Savannah,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I've had the same experience. I haven't had mine work, and I've had a few of them.
Helpful to know. Thank you both. All right, guys. So thank you again, both Brittany, Savannah. This was awesome. I certainly learned a lot, and now I'm questioning if I want to be a beekeeper or not. But as I said at the very beginning, following this call, you will receive an email from me with a link to watch the recording. If you have any questions that you want to ask after this presentation, you can feel free to respond directly to that email. I'm happy to field your questions to both Brittany and Savannah. And then for myself and on behalf of the Alliance, thank you all for being here today. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.